What is the worst smell in the world? My old job was a disaster cleanup job. We were responsible for cleaning up fire, water, mold, and biohazards. Occasionally we would get called out to clear and remove refrigerators. I hated it every single time because we would have to put those biosuits and masks. It was bad enough I was barely able to breathe with those on. One claim we had: the apartment hadn't been occupied for quite some time, the lights had been off, and these people had a refrigerator, and a meat locker, and these were full. The worst I've smelled in no particular order: body decomp. Walk-in freezer with 1,000 pounds of meat and no power for 10 months. MRSA infection where a guy just kept putting another sock over his leg. It looked like a cast, but it was 30 layers of sock and infected tissue. Colostomy bag spill. Bathroom where homeless had orgies over a weekend where at least one had a bad yeast infection. Smelled like dead fish, old beer, puke, outhouse, and Listerine. As a second or third year med student, I took a week-long pathology autopsy elective for shits and giggles. Of all the stuff I experienced, I will never forget accidentally nicking the bowels with my scalpel of an obese man who had been dead for 12 hours. I was wearing a face shield, and still felt the pressure release blow my hair back immediately before becoming weak-kneed from the stench. All shits and no giggles are had. Rendering plants. It's the kind of stink that stays with you for days. I was a sales rep for a company that did business with a rendering plant. They took me through a door that had a pile of about 30 dead and decaying cows. They take the cows and cut them up and render the rotting fat. The smell stayed on my jacket for a couple of washes. I guess the plant also rendered dead zoo animal and washed up whales on occasion. I had a regular and was a really bad alcoholic for decades before getting sober, and he developed edema. His legs were so swollen with fluid that they were weeping, and even though he had them wrapped and was wearing clothes, I could smell it throughout the entire store, and we'd have to air it out once he left. I unfortunately have a really bad gag reflex to smell too, and I felt so bad, but it made me feel physically ill. In my grandparents' old country house there was an old water reservoir nearby that hadn't been used for a long time. One day at my grandmother's request, my father and I drained it to clean it. The sediment that remained after removing the water was like a custard made from algae, with the remains of multiple decomposing bodies of the cats, squirrels and birds that dared to approach that pit of hell. That smell! I used to be a janitor. The sanitary product bin in the stalls in the women's restroom always had a funky smell. It's a unique smell. It's a bad smell, but nothing too terrible. Anyways, someone put a dirty diaper in there on a Friday night and it stayed there until Monday night when I cleaned it. That's a smell greater than the sum of its parts. It was worse than when the sewage backed up. I consider myself to have a strong stomach, but my former co-worker had the most heinous smelling breath, to the point where when we were standing next to each other at work I could smell it through our face masks. I remember gagging underneath mine. Nothing repulses me like hot-ass stench coming from a person's mouth. I still remember the smell too. Honestly, one of the worst I've encountered. The only smell the human body cannot adjust to is sulfur. Things like decomposition and rot include sulfur. Hot springs and rotten eggs, sulfur. So, while this may not be the correct opinion, it is in fact the worst smell in the world. My answer is that protein shake bottle you left in your car while it was hot, and then it explodes and you're like, I suspect we need some chemical engineers to chime in here, because all of the organic chemistry listed so far is probably nothing compared to what can be produced in a chemistry lab. Not listed as a smell, but who knows? Here is an article that might be interesting to some of you. Not sure about the definitive answer, but the worst smell I ever smelled was this one. We had a dog that got sick and in the middle of the night had diarrhea. It got scared that it would get in trouble, so it ate it. Which made it sick, and it threw it back up in a pile on the floor. The smell was so foul it burned into my brain for all eternity. When I worked on the grounds maintenance at a golf course, one of the things I had to do was change the water in the ball washers. There's something extraordinarily disgusting about dirty, muddy, golf ball washer water that has been baking in the hot sun in a cast vessel every day for multiple weeks. Just instantly gag-worthy. I had to do a 4U biolab where we crushed up liver to test enzyme catalase reactions, and even though I wore gloves, I could smell the liver on my hands for days, maybe weeks. I think the main issue was I had a useless lab partner for that project, so the emotional damage from stress was also rough. I can't stand liver smell now. I worked at a scent and flavor factory. We were emptying out the warehouse and there were decaying cans of strawberry concentrate. Nothing on this planet smelled as offensive as Ultra Strawberry Concentrate. To this day I cannot go near strawberry candy. I will remember that smell until the day I die. Also Smurfs Magma, my obese upstairs neighbor. She's smell has traveled down to the second and first floor for months now. All she does is sit in the hall spraying air freshener. I don't see her leave to do laundry or take out trash. Walking into my apartment makes me sick. The owner is embarrassed to say something. Nurse paramedic here. I feel uniquely qualified to address this. Gangrenous trot. Nursing home patient had an infected tracheostomy that became necrotic. Gaseous subQ. It was indescribable. Then I remembered I had to get an airway without aerosolizing the worst smell in the world. Rotting corpse. I think people are just like hardwired to be offended by the smell of rotting bodies, but that shit is horrible, especially if they've been sitting out for a while. The steak you left in your fridge too long is no comparison, it's a whole different level of rot. Bloated corpse or soup, people died in shower with water left on. Former EMT. Also, having to carry some old folks out of their houses. We would rock paper scissors for who had to grab the legs. Thank Jeebus for surgical masks with an alcohol swab stuck in it, a factory that makes pure gluten flour. Not kidding, the worst smell I have experienced. Initially yeasty like fresh bread, and then an odor that will make you swear off of bread for a while. Hard to explain, but like fresh vomit mixed with just baked bread. Horrible. Probably the time we discovered that our deep freezer shorted out after we lost power in a storm. A week after the storm. An entire freezer filled with half the hog worth of processed meat sitting in our garage for 1 week during August in the American South. A lot of these most are a giant combination of smells. It's like asking the best taste in the world would be supreme buttered thin crust garlic pizza with dipping sauce. More specifically, the worst smell I've smelled is dimethyl sulfide or thioacetone. Teenage boy. Me and my mom once picked up my little brother from school, and my god did he reek. It was like red onions, but 1000x worse. My mom opened all of the windows in the car for the rest of the ride home. Even though it was in the middle of winter, I made some pasta and red sauce and left it in a covered pot to put away later. Several days later I went to move what looked like a dirty pot to the sink to clean and noticed it was heavy, and I took off the lid. That was the worst smell in the world. Was in high school. Found some old plastic bottles, thought they were full of stashed liquor. Opened one and the smell hit my nose, wretched. Turns out there were multiple years old bottles of dip spit, which had been fermenting away. My friend had a polynoidal cyst that ruptured while we were abroad. After over 24 hours of air travel back home, with no place to shower, I can honestly say the smell that was there when I threw up was the worst thing I've ever smelled. Worst thing I ever smelled was when I accidentally stepped on a ground nest full of rotten eggs. I had to throw my shoes away. Even though it only got on the bottom of my shoe. No matter what I did, I couldn't get the smell to come out. My roommate's air fryer. He cooks eggs, hamburgers, and sausage in it and hasn't cleaned it since we moved in 3 months. It smells like straight decay, and the grease buildup is almost up to the little metal plate you sit everything on. Deer repellent spray is pretty repulsive. Smells like someone ate a bag of shit, then shit that shit into Tupperware, then left it in the sun for a few days and then ate it and then barfed it back up. It smells really bad. Are in here. The worst smell for me was a tampon that was forgotten about for a month and then discovered after a CD screening. We had to literally clear out our clinic for 2 hours to allow the smell to dissipate, inside of a diaper pail. Specifically Diaper Genie. Just absolutely dreaded taking that lid off to take out the trash. That smell is burned into my consciousness, and haven't had a kid in diapers in 8 years. If you really get hit hard by a skunk, it gets so smelly that it changes, like it becomes electric. And you never get used to it. My very hairy golden retriever got it bad and I had to wash her. It was hell. Something dead and rotting. Like, a rat that died underneath something a few weeks back and you move the something covering the dead rat. Think, a burger in your fridge that recently went bad x 50 million, vomiting face. Dead rotting livestock truck, smelled it once a mile off on the motorway and still can smell it in my head. Something about death, obviously from the evolutionary standard, triggers us insanely. So if someone gets a bowel obstruction, poop can back up into their stomach, get digested and then thrown up. This leads to the most horrid smell I experienced in my years as a nurse. People say it's not, but durian is real bad. Like week old dumpster fermented onions bad. Week's rain on pig shit bad. Paris Metro bad. Well, maybe not that bad, but certainly not good. Unwashed cooch is the worst thing I have ever smelt in my life. It lingered, too, for like the whole fucking day. I have washed my nuts thoroughly ever since because fucking hell. There is a paper mill in Jessup, Georgia, it is awful. There is a soybean mill in Decatur, Illinois, it is awful. Those are the two worst smell I've ever smelled. And it travels for miles. A moldy sponge. Dry your sponges out or else they emit a chemical smell that is unwashable off your hands. Fuck that shit, it's gross smelling. Smell of death is pretty bad too. Set a live trap out in the woods when I was like 8 and forgot about it. A week later my grandpa asked where it was and I showed him that shit was so bad. Got any ass whooped too. My father-in-law is a microbiologist. At his office they have an oven which you walk in and it's full of petty dishes. That's the worst smell I have ever smelt, that walk-in oven. Once I lost some hard-boiled eggs under a seat in my car in the Texas heat. I traveled for work so didn't use the car for a week and a half, and when I got back it was awful. Leachate. It's the gases coming from the liquids that built up in landfills. They tried to burn them off with burners but when we get a slow west wind it's absolutely awful. Restaurant worker here. Rotten potatoes smell like death and GI bleed combined. Double points if you've actually grabbed one and stuck your finger into the potato puss. This separate from the normal autopsies decomposition autopsy room in Baltimore to witness the autopsy of a man who had been in the Chesapeake Bay for 3 weeks. One time I found a family of mice that had drowned in a half-buried Gatorade bottle. I poured it out and the decomposition smell is something I'll never forget. Back in the high school days, some animal died in the walls. Texas heat got to it. I'm 35 years removed from those days and still remember that death smell.